And you know, he told me many times he would sit with families crying with them because their children had died, and he knew that this was totally avoidable. It was avoidable with the 19th century technology, which is to say a well. You know, the stuff that we have, you know, this is in the early 80s. Think of it, we're about to launch the Macintosh computer, and waterborne diseases are still basically responsible for, you know, most of the child deaths in the world. So he started doing this, and he started spending all his summers, and then after he graduated, he started traveling around the developing world, dropping wells one by one. And I remember he said to me, he said, this is just to give you a sense of the thinking in the early 80s about how you solve social change. He said, I started enrolling in flight school because I realized I would need to get a pilot's license so that I could get an airplane so I could fly from village to village to village to start dropping wells, so he could drop more wells. So this is kind of like the white knight coming in one by one, solving the world's problems, and then going away. So then Gary got this job working for Catholic Relief Services, where it was his dream job. He was able to, he was overseeing the Catholic Relief Services water projects throughout all of Latin America. And so he started going around from village to village to village, looking at the projects, and what he saw what just kind of horrified him. And studies have shown that half of the water projects in the world at the time were failures, right? So you're talking about basically, you know, the world's oldest public health problem, which is access to potable water. In the 1980s, while Steve Jobs is building, you know, this totally cool computer, we are not dropping wells around the world, or people are not dropping wells around the world, so that children don't die before the age of 5. Like, what was going on? Why isn't that happening? So Gary actually spent 10 years trying to figure out what's going wrong. Why aren't we doing this? And in retrospect, it looks almost blindingly obvious, right? I mean, and this is why I'm so hopeful, because what he realized was, when you bring a well into a community, I mean, the first thing that you have to ask is, when you leave, will people be able to repair the well? Right? That's a pretty important thing, because the well will always break down. The pump will break down, something. So the first thing you need is are there parts? Is there a supply chain? Okay? Then the next thing you need to know is there a committee of villagers who actually care about the well, who know how to maintain a well, and who think it's important to do? Is there any money to do this? Is there a budget, or is there some sort of agreement that the community comes to sort of make this all happen? And so he started thinking that we were completely backwards. We were dropping these wells and walking away from things and figuring out how to unleash these processes, to figure out what the supply chains are, and to come in with the resources to make this happen. So over about a 15-year period, Water Partners strategy, which they called Water Credit. So they don't even drop wells anymore, they just provide organizations so that they could manage their own water delivery projects. And then they come in with a little bit, they've seen thousands of these projects around the world, so they're very, very good at identifying wrong and helping people to anticipate. So if you think about what the skills are, this is basically a business, right? It's pretty much a business. How do you keep a business sustainable? You have to have a supply chain, you have to have some sort of management process, you have to have all of these things in place. So what any student would have gained in, like, you know, their first year in business school, or probably their first 2 courses in business school, what they would have learned, has now been injected into the process for creating these water projects around the world. And what's interesting now is if you go to the big funders, whether it's the Gates Foundation or, you know, the United Nations Development Program, they don't provide funding for water projects anymore unless they look like this, unless they're basically smart. Right? So we've stopped doing essentially a lot of things that were pre-enlightenment, which is to say you parachute into a village, you sort of do something and you disappear and you magically hope that that thing will continue working, which all sense will tell you wouldn't. And we've now moved to a rational approach to problem solving, which is what Water Partners and hundreds of other organizations are doing around the world. Now, so if you think, okay, that's where we're starting today. If you move 20 years out, and you know, from now until say 2030 or even sooner, you can think of all the places around the world that are now using this process. And they're not only using it for water, they're using that thinking for solar projects and for other kinds of health projects. You can begin to imagine that the graveyard of failed development projects that we've accumulated over the past, say, 40 years or 50 years will be replaced with, hopefully, structures that actually work. And that's incredibly hopeful. I mean, imagine if we really do solve the world's water problem so that only a tiny percentage of the world deaths are due to children not having potable water. You can really get onto a higher level challenge, like education and stuff like that. It may not happen, but we now actually know what mistakes we made in the past, so we can do it smarter. And the people who have the money and the policymakers and the entrepreneurs are now in place to do things like that. And you can see the same thing happening in the field of microfinance. Microfinance, as I mentioned, is reaching 150 million people around the world. But there's a lot of research now that shows, oh, it doesn't always work in some cases. When does it work, when doesn't work? And there's actually these places like the Poverty Action Lab at MIT and the Financial Access Initiative. They're now doing randomized control studies to look at when does microfinance work, when doesn't it work, how does it work. Now, this is such a radical departure from where we were in the field of social change 20 years ago. I mean, it used to be 20 years ago for an after-school program, for example, people didn't even count whether or not the students got better by being in an after-school program. All they did was they would report how many children attended. Basically, they would report how many chairs there were that were filled. And that was the way that they reported success. Okay? By the way, most after-school programs in the United States still report success this way. So you can just see, if you're unsuccessful at educating kids, but you get more and more kids each year that you're unsuccessful educating, you claim more success and you get more funding for being less successful every year. And that's basically, you know, the federal government spends about $1 billion a year on after-school programs that work still that way. So what was happening is we're beginning to see now in fields like microfinance and in other fields, when does microfinance work? Because we're measuring it with these controlled studies. So for example, we now know that microfinance, one of the most important things about microfinance is actually savings. Savings is really highly correlated with life changes. Loans, what the loans do actually is very interesting, is sometimes it doesn't always lead to increased consumption or increased poverty alleviation, but what it does is it dramatically reduces people's anxiety. Because the experience of poverty is not only that you don't have a lot of things, it's that you're always worried that you won't have enough tomorrow. So you live with constant anxiety. It's like your whole life is 2 days before exams. You know, it's like it's really stressful, and actually probably a lot of illness in the developing world comes from that constant anxiety. So what people now discover is that if they have access to microloans, it really stabilizes their lives, and they don't have this very, very bumpy ride in life as much anymore. They have a sort of smoother kind of ride. They still have a poverty struggle, but they're able to predict how things are going to go beyond today and tomorrow. They can predict a month or 2 or 3 months ahead, which is a huge change in terms when you take poor people and you help them to be more future oriented. That really leads to all sorts of other social changes like family planning and education of daughters and things like that. So these are just new insights that have only come in the last year or two. But if you extrapolate from the trajectory of where they're leading microfinance, we will have a much smarter microfinance industry 5 years from now than we had 5 years ago, because we're actually learning very quickly. And so these changes, you're entering the world of social change at a time when we really have a tremendous opportunity to solve problems, not just to, quote, work on them, but to put them. I mean, and you know, Muhammad Yunus will say, we can put poverty in the museum. You know, imagine your grandchildren going to a museum so that they can see an artifact of what poverty was like, the way we look at fossils today. Imagine how people used to live. They used to do leaching and bloodletting. You know, they'll look at poverty the same way. And it's, when I think about these things, it's very, very exciting. So to make these changes happen, the people who are sort of behind and kind of like leading these changes have some interesting characteristics that they in the way that they work. And this is kind of what, you know, this is what we were talking about. What are the characteristics of what you can call social entrepreneurs or innovators? What what defines them in terms, and how are they different from, say, the traditional, maybe activists that we think of when we think of the 60s, or people who work in